But my first question is more general, and I would like to ask you both regarding the photography in the Soviet period, and we were talking about invisibility or visibility. And my first question is, do you see that the photography from the Soviet period is more invisible? And secondly, I will ask my second one also, how do we deal, or what do we do with the boxes of negatives or unresearched materials from the Soviet period? Yeah, maybe.
Do I start? It's a shame that I keep seeing Alise only in the screen whenever I come to a conference. It keeps happening. Well, I think to a researcher, some invisible archive which is discovered is a treasure, and only while preparing for this presentation, I have read that there are lots of invisible photographs by Šonta, which nobody has seen, so I'm already intrigued, and I'm thinking maybe this could be another topic, to research it. So of course, for researchers, it's clear, you just have to get access to that archive and see what's there. And it's always possible to create interesting new stories from what you discover. Everybody knows that who is a researcher of photography. Because photographic archives are disorderly, in the sense that there are plenty of stuff there which is unintended, all topics are mixed, all genres are mixed up, and you can get really creative. So such invisibility, it's really nice now. It's really what we crave, actually, because everything seems to be researched, known. We get bored with the same pictures. To talk about Šonta today was a good occasion for me to remember him, to think about him, and so on. But I know these photos by heart. Laima had shown his guys in an exhibition, which also we have seen, and we know this by heart. It has to be reinterpreted again. But this visibility in Soviet times, it was kind of, it existed, but it was partial in many cases, like in Šonta's case, it was partial. He was visible and invisible. But actually the 30 years of independence has shown so much light on censorship and everything that now it's even difficult to talk about them being invisible, because, as I said, we know them by heart.
Alise?
Yeah, Annika, thank you for your question. I was thinking about the first part of your question, that are archives more invisible from Soviet period, and at least in Latvia, I think for 100% the answer would be yes, because it's also part, I wouldn't say it has to do with censorship, but it's rather the inner dynamics of the art world, if we could say, because, for example, within, let's say, since the late 90s or middle of the 90s and until recently, photography from the Soviet period has really appeared on a very kind of very fragmented occasions. For example, it would be just a couple of artists, a couple of photographers who have had books published. So let's say there is 4 or 5 names that kind of everybody knows because their work has been made visible in a form of publication and in that way legitimized. Then, for example, the Latvian National Museum of Art began collecting photography only in 2011. So that's relatively recent. And of course, they are also, that means they also just at the very early stages of collecting and organizing this collection. So only recently, just a few years back, for the first time, photography was featured also in this permanent display of post-war art. So that also just adds one small, seemingly small part of this visibility, but at the same time, I think it's tremendously important because when people see photography in this art museum, they also somehow gradually realize that it can be part of this art historical narrative. Because so far, photography in Latvia, how I see it, mostly has existed in somewhat parallel to the so-called real art world, like painting and whatever is considered real art, and photography is always this side movement. And what is interesting that it has functioned as somewhat enclosed circle because only close friends know about it. Let's say there have been a lot of photography exhibitions, but I would also argue that mostly it's been a very limited amount of people who go to these exhibitions and who know about these photographers. And in the if we talk about the broader society, then for them photography has largely to be specific, photography from Soviet times has remained largely invisible, except these couple of names who have had like these books published, as I mentioned, and now also maybe those artists whose work is included in this permanent display of the museum.
I just want to add one more moment, which I remembered. I don't think I would be giving a presentation to a Lithuanian audience about Šonta because everybody knows him, as I said. But I see a huge point in talking about these photographers from Soviet times to an international audience. It's what Alise also said, but also because of the Iron Curtain, our art and photographies were not known at the time when they were created. They were not known abroad, and people could communicate only a little bit. It was difficult. Of course they did, but still there were lots of obstacles. And we kind of still have to fill this gap of the invisibility of our national art in general in the world.
But what do you do with the boxes that are full of negatives?
Oh. Well, I thought I said, well, it's difficult, of course, to look at negatives, but there are ways, and scan them and see what's there, and then think what you can make of it.
In an exhibition, well,
exhibition.
This is actually also a question I wanted to ask from Alise, because most of the archive of Senta is invisible also because it was negatives and test prints. So what, in your case, it was this artistic intervention that actually made them visible. So yeah, it's more of a comment, not even a question, but maybe you want to comment on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Agnė, you wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to say I really liked the way the artist intervened or dealt with these negatives. I haven't seen this exhibition, of course, but from your presentation, I can see it was very interesting, and yeah, that's one of the ways how to deal with it. Every time I think you can imagine, you have to imagine something new.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the different ways how to approach that the archive, and I think this artistic intervention was successful because the archive was not part of the institutional collection just yet. It was still family's property, and family was also interested in this. And also I'm part of this family, so we were able to kind of give the artist completely green light to work with the archive, whatever way she feels is interesting also to her. After such an archive becomes part of an institutional collection, then I think there is the possibilities become more limited, because then it's again part of this institutional structure where there are rules and regulations, and probably the most likely scenario would be that, for example, negatives will be scanned and then made available for viewing that way, and so on. So that's a comment from my side.
Well, thank you. I think I will open the floor to comments and questions now.
As I was already obliged to ask something, then I was wondering about the relationship between professionalism and amateurism in the Soviet heritage. You know, that as Alise told, like Senta, you know, made hardly any exhibition prints. So we have those boxes of negatives, but we don't, you know, there isn't actually her choice. You know, we have her photos. So I was also wondering that Agnė, isn't part of the excitement that we get from those boxes related to that, there is, how to say, that we can do with them what we want, or like that we can suddenly, that, you know, where the professionalism, amateurism also comes is that it has a very particular position in photography. You know, an amateur photographer is the artist, and the professional one does the professional photos. You know, it's like kind of this very old tradition of it. And then we got to this Soviet tradition, or Soviet situation where in Lithuania you actually have photo artists, and anywhere else in Soviet Union you have, you know, you have only amateurs. Or you have journalists and so on, but you have only amateurs. So yeah, isn't how to say, which effect does this freedom of us as historians or as researchers to say what is valuable, what not, what kind of effect does it have on the way how the history of photography is perceived?
Great question. Actually, I always think when I see somebody doing something from a forgotten archive, that they are creating an artist. Like when I was in Tartu and talked about Veronika Šleivytė, it was from the interwar period. It was precisely that. She was just snapping pictures, and we are making exhibitions, books, and so on. But it's possible, you know, it's possible. Also, photography is such a flexible medium in that sense that you can turn it into anything you want, it seems. That, you know, any image, conceptualists using identity photos for conceptual projects, you know, it's done many times, and this can be inverted in many ways. So yeah, we are creating artists out of nowhere, out of something that people didn't consider as art. But doesn't a similar thing happen with writing, when people write memoirs and then they are published as something for everybody, not memoirs, but diaries, as something for everybody to read? And I've read somewhere about writers' diaries which were not meant for publication, just for oneself, and it is seen as problematic that, you know, they didn't mean that form of writing to be seen by others, because when they publish something, they really rewrite it, change it, take the words out, put more clever words in, and then you reveal that side of writing they never wanted to reveal. So I feel that it's similar with photography.
Can I add to the question, because my question is related to that, because it's interesting, like this power dynamic, who is creating who, actually. So thinking about Zenta's case, so obviously in a way like the material is used and it's sort of, it's still like kind of material, and like in Alise's presentation, there were always like both names, but when we look at the poster in Kunstverein, that's only the name of the photographer who were using the archives. So what is the legacy of the like original author, how to say? And I'm thinking about Sherry Levine when she's always stating that, yes, like she took a photograph after Edward Weston or something. Shouldn't it be always like somehow two names present? It's a question, I don't know. It's perhaps for all of you, because I actually enjoyed your presentation, and thank you for that. I forgot to say thank you.
It's for all of us. Maybe Annika can answer. She keeps asking questions but not answering.
Yeah, but I'm not sure about the answer. I don't think, it's a thought that I don't have an answer right now.
I can comment maybe quickly, yes. So thank you for both questions. They are yeah, great, and of course there is no single and fast answer to both questions. And I think to the first question, I think Agnė gave a very nice answer. I really like the way how Agnė you approached that. And yeah, because I was also thinking, of course, it is choices that are being made, and like you, Agnė, mentioned these diaries. That was one great example of material that was not meant to be seen by others, and then later, after a certain time, somebody comes and brings it out to the public, and how we are supposed to look at that. Just a quick comment on that, for example, in Zenta's case, it's a little bit different, because I think from what I know, when she was making these photographs, she was, most of the time she was conscious that she is trying to make art, so to speak. It was just, there was no audience for that art. There was no cultural context where she could exhibit these works and where they would be understood or appreciated. So that is also one of the reasons why she consciously finished, let's say, or ended her artistic career after a little bit more than 10 years, because she understood that what she is interested in, that kind of images, there is just simply no audience, no context for that. And in that sense, I think when we, almost half a century or more than half a century later, when we are looking at these images, I think it is, in a way, we are honoring that finally there is an audience. Finally, there are people who could appreciate that kind of images. there are people who are interested. And also, just a quick comment on the choices. It's also history is always a series of choices. For example, the existing history of photography, as we know, it is also a result of conscious choices by mostly, let's say, male historians who are always preferred the work of other male artists. So those are also choices. It's not natural, or it's not self-explanatory how these existing histories are being made. So now we are able to make different choices, and that's, I think, that's what is happening. It's not that previously the history was natural and not made by choices, and now we suddenly are making these choices. It's just now we are able to make slightly different choices. And also, thank you for the second question about the authorship and copyright and all these things and attribution. Those are very, there's a lot of directions to think about. And so far it has been that Sophie Thun, whenever she uses Zenta's images, there is the description and the credit is given later in the exhibition text, but the work is Sophie's, and the solo exhibition is the presentation of Sophie's work. So it's still called the Sophie Thun solo exhibition name, titled this or the other, and then the source of the images is described in some introductory text. So far it's one way how to work with it, but it's also absolutely open-ended, and I'm also curious to see where it goes and how this interesting collaboration develops in the future. But thank you for the question, and thank you for raising this important issue.
I just want to add something also about both issues. It's interesting what you, Alise, said about pictures not wanted, at the time when they're made, because there are plenty of such cases in Lithuania as well. And I can imagine that Zenta's production was framed by those men, what was expected of a woman photographer. You described them as horses, some landscapes, something lyrical, beautiful, maybe, but you didn't show those pictures, so I don't know. And of course, they imagined what it should be, but then there is also requirements of the time. Like in Lithuanian photography in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was some expectation what photography is art photography. Sutkus and this child in the front with his sad existential face and something like that. Or Sartre walking in the dunes, the lonely figure, philosophical stuff. And photographers themselves who live long enough to experience this time, I mean independence, starting from 2000s, they started digging in their archives themselves and printing negatives which they never considered printing before, because they didn't correspond to that idea of what this art photography should look like. So a living photographer is also revising his own, usually it's his own archives, but sometimes her own archives. It never happened in Lithuania with her own archives yet, but with his own archives. And there are new exhibitions of never seen before works by the same photographer, because for example, in 2000s, we started valuing images that have a mistake in them, that are somehow, show some periphery, they are imperfect and show some everyday life instead of some lonely philosophical figure. So this changing perception of what photography is art this changes what we take out of the archives, and it's very interesting to me. And the other side about authorship, I just remembered the case of Vytautas Stanionis, which also this authorship thing changed in time with the changing conception of photography. His father, also Vytautas Stanionis, photographed people in a village, I think it was in 1946, for Soviet passports. It was just identity photos. And his son, who was angry about his father or something, he burned his negatives, but one was somehow left. And he printed those shots, full shots, in huge format and showed it in an art exhibition. The trick was that the first Stanionis, it was poor times, he was saying material, so he was photographing two people at once, father and son, mother and daughter, and so on. And this youngest Stanionis printed them both, the full shot. And it became very conceptual, travel around the world, and so on. And the authorship was of the first old Stanionis. The young Stanionis started to regret this, that he made this, because his father became more famous than him. And he was then cutting those images, doing some conceptual stuff with them, just to get rid of, to become more famous than his father. But then people started to realize, actually quite recently, like a few years ago, that, come on, this is conceptual photography. It's the one who does something with the image is the author, not the one who photographed it. And then we opened old catalogs of exhibitions from 1993, the exhibitions created by Peter Linnap, and we saw that he was writing exactly that then already. But nobody, not nobody read, but nobody take it into account, because the time didn't come yet to understand this as a different kind of authorship. So authorship in photography is also a very interesting subject.
I would like to do a couple of comments, and some part of it Laima already asked, but still, I think it's talking not just about authorship, but I think about the narration is also very vital. And I think they obviously goes very close as with the authorship questions of ethics, and that, and who is telling the story of whom, and how you tell the story, and in that sense, kind of I would like to bring a sample as, the most known sample, right, is Vivian Meyer, who left like unknown photographer at all, and she was like rediscovered by a one person. And what is kind of makes me actually angry about that story of her is how quickly she was pictured almost like a mad woman. And this very famous documentary about her, I don't know if it's about her, but it's exactly like ended up in that sort of conclusion, her being kind of obsessed, mad, living in a cellar with the boxes, which really frustrates me, because that's also a choice, which the collector who had the money, managed to have all her archives, decided to project to the world. So it's really, as soon as it's in the world, it's really hard to break it. And much harder, it's the same as Alice was saying, as soon as in some kind of collection, it's much harder to add something to it, or break it, or make alternative narrative. So I think that is also about the choices, who is presenting, and the second, which is kind of comes of that, it's again, Zenta sample, I'm just like nearly crying, it's so like, upsetting that the women, again, get to know only when they die. It's just like, it's unbearable. It's really unbearable. I'm working on a project, this is my job, working on a project, Fast Forward Women in Photography. We're 8 years just doing that, trying to bring visibility to women in the photography world, like sooner before they die, and doing quite lots of events around it. And it's again kind of upsetting, but for me, it is the question, maybe it's Alise, if you have an answer, it's still a puzzle in me, like in the Zenta stories, she died in 2011, so it's like it's 20 years after Latvia got independence. So what happened? Why there was no any visibility? And it's also for me is interesting, which referring to what Agnė is saying, kind of that after 1991, some male photographers start to revisit their archives. So again, what the contemporary artist doing with Zenta archives is she's revisiting the works when she was young. So did she continue taking pictures till, for example, in 2000s, and where are they? And how it kind of happened that even with the freedom of speech, she still stayed invisible for 20 years, living kind of in an independent country. So for me, that's what a puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you for your question and your, there is no, of course, there is no also easy answers to all this. I can just give maybe a couple of comments to maybe understand Zenta's case a little bit better, but of course there is, I am pretty sure that there is also many other cases, other women photographers who are not even discovered just yet maybe, or whose work is not, whose work has been forgotten and hasn't been rediscovered yet. But with Zenta, first of all, in the early 1970s, she herself put all her so-called photographic career behind her, because she realized that this is not the context where she could continue producing work. There is no audience, or there is no interest in that kind of work that would be interesting for herself, and she continued working as a graphic designer until the mid 90s, and there was some interest in her work in the late 90s, and in 1991 she was able to organize her first solo exhibition, and she was able to organize one more exhibition of her work in 2005. If I'm not mistaken. But both of these exhibitions also, interestingly, were not received well, let's say, in Latvian art world. I think she just remained misunderstood somehow. That's the feeling I get. There were a couple of very good reviews in art magazines, for example. But in general, I think her name still remained somehow mostly outside this new independent art world, and that's maybe that's just a comment that I can make right now.
Very quickly. So I have one comment and one question. So as a comment for Alise, perhaps, I want to say that it's a very interesting way how you found this way, this artistic intervention, how to make one archive visible. I haven't seen the exhibition, but on the photos and how you described this, it was looked very nice, and it's maybe an interesting way, not maybe just to like highlight this archive in an academic journal or in an article, but to have artists working on an archive, not even like a curator or academician, but an artist. And the other question is, maybe it's in a way it's radical, but I wanted to still ask this, and this is for Agnė, and regarding Sonta's different series. I mean, Sonta was depicting people are marginal groups, and in a way how you started with the school is my home project and switched it to the guys project, and in the middle you showed a photo, the flight, and as I googled, I understood that this is one of his most famous, and some photos from the school project. And I wanted to ask about the gaze, the gaze that the photographer has. And I could see that maybe the gaze was at some photos even similar. And the flight, I think you mentioned about something like admiring male bodies. And on this photo, I see children. And also there was this one photo of I don't know if it's an orphan or holding his hands, and I'm thinking whether he might have used similar gaze for those projects, or this famous flight photo. How would you see this in the present light? I mean, there are still children there depicted.
Oh, you mean a case of pedophilia?
No, not this, no. But I'm just thinking, I mean, there's a very common thread between, I mean, there are people who weren't maybe visible in the socialist regime and were marginalized and hidden from the public. But then I'm thinking about how, technically or gaze-wise, he approached those projects.
Well, now, of course, if you try to photograph children in public place, you will get in trouble and you won't be able to photograph it. But then there were no such problems. People didn't think it was bad or something. I mean, take Sutkus, he was photographing children all the time in the streets. Only not I mean in their underwear, but sometimes even in underwear. There are photos of, there is a photo by Sutkus of children standing on a bridge, bending over to look at the river, and a girl's underpants are visible. And it was okay at that time, nobody saw any problem in it. So this gaze then was not acknowledged, I imagine, as something strange, bad, or whatever. And his photograph also doesn't show anything what can be considered as bad. When I put it next to the people of guys, where he photographs men in his studio, I mean men who consented to it, obviously, so it looks like, oh, okay, and what was happening there, but actually these are very different time periods even, so yeah, what happens when you put photographs from two different projects and time periods next to each other, it's again another story, and it affects how we see them. But I don't think there was a pedophile case, nothing of that I know of. But the gaze, it just, I don't think it was acknowledged. That's something like that. He was photographing these jumping children, not really from a distance, because some guys are very close, but I think it was quite normal to have around some men with a camera, no problem. Not that I heard of. Actually, there were cases when photographers came to a place where they were not welcomed and they were kicked out during those times as well, actually. When, for example, Macijauskas was photographing country markets, the people sometimes got angry with him, kicked him out. That's what he told me. Or when Požerskis was photographing people in churches, he also got kicked out sometimes. So, yeah, probably it was the case also of finding contact. And probably Shonta found contact with these people. I don't know fully what kind of contact, sorry. Yeah, you could think of lots of things, that's true today. Yeah.
I was just like, I mean, this was something that stood out when I saw all those photos, and then when it when children were depicted, then only like boys, and then I was trying to like understand if it could have been like a similar gaze, and if we could, how would we approach this today? Of course, like then times were different, but this is something that somehow stood out.
It is a very important question, actually, and I didn't want to think about it, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can continue this discussion after the final words. Thank you, Agnė, and thank you, Alise, for joining me here and joining this Baltic seminar that looks more like looked more like a conference to me. And thank you, Anu, again, and the floor is yours for final announcements.
I have only very little to say, basically nothing, but thank you very much for coming. Thank you for staying this long on Saturday evening. We have talked with Eda and some other people that we felt that the seminar came out even more interesting than we expected. I hope that we're not like delusional or just somehow. But it really, I think it was extremely interesting and a real pleasure to be a part of. And we have recorded the whole event, so if you just want, if some of you want to rewatch something, then it can be easily arranged. We will discuss whether we will publish the talks publicly or not. And as said in the beginning, that the general idea was to that this seminar is a basis for future cooperation projects. So let's think about it a bit and then let's move on. And we already had some ideas with Eda for the next seminar, perhaps in a few years. And Lithuanians, the National Gallery of Art in Lithuania, they were offering that they could do something similar in Vilnius and so on. So let's stay in touch, and thanks again for coming, and see you.